Miscoll with EMS now. Welcome to this episode of the Eric Miscoll Show. Our topic today is material supply chain. We're going to get an update from our two guests. Before I begin, just quick housekeeping for everybody logging in. You are muted. If you wish to ask questions, use the question tab, and we will try to weave those questions into our discussion. And the show is being recorded and will be rebroadcasted probably early next week for on EMS Now and pushed out. Enough on that. Let's get at it. The material supply chain, it's been a challenging few years. So we called back in our panel on to discuss this. We have a new panelist with us today, so let me begin by introducing him by name. I'll give him a chance in a moment to introduce himself more fully, but John Drabik is the new president of the Americas for TTi. He replaces Don Akery, who has moved on to another challenge in his career, taking on another job as a CEO. We also are joined by Dale Ford, the chief analyst with the ECIA, who has been on the show before. So gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. And as always, we have Phil Stoten logging in, not from down under this time, but from Europe, where he's finally broken out of his self-imposed lockdown.
It wasn't self-imposed, Eric.
And after 2 years, I think it was, Phil, right?
Yeah.
So welcome to the free world. John, let's start with you. Let me allow you chance to introduce yourself to the audience so that they have a better sense of you.
Very good. Thank you, Eric. And good afternoon, everybody. And I appreciate the opportunity to join the panel. A little bit about myself. So I've been in the electronics industry for 25 years now. Started out 18 years with a capacitor supplier, Chemet Electronics, where I did various roles in product and sales. Then decided to join distribution and spent 6 years at Arrow in Denver. And recently joined TTi about 2 years ago, and I'm located here in our office in Fort Worth.
Very good. And Dale, what would you like to tell us about yourself, sir?
Well, just briefly, I've been in the industry roughly about the same amount of time as John, but most of that as a market research analyst, career spanning DataQuest Gartner Group, then co-founding the iSupply Market Research, which was then acquired by IHS Markit, and now has been split up between Informa and S&P. So I've had a chance to be a front row observer of the development of the electronics components industry, and it's been an exciting ride.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed.
No more exciting time than now.
No kidding. Listen, I know before we get into the nuanced issues around the supply chain, I wanted to start with kind of the big picture issues, certainly having an impact on the world and on the supply chain currently, those being the war in the Ukraine and also the impact that COVID is having in the current lockdown across many of the major cities within China. You know, those are pretty severe. You know, it's been a year of severe things. So maybe Dale, let me start with you. How do you see those two issues kind of at a 10,000 foot level impacting, and how are you viewing those?
Well, it's interesting. I recently finished interviews with a number of top distribution industry executives, and one of the questions that comes up all the time is how much longer are we going to be battling these highly inflated lead times? And one of the executives, this was 2 weeks after Russia had invaded Ukraine, and he said, well, my answer would have been different if you had asked me that 2 weeks ago. So this probably the number one issue on everybody's radar right now is how to manage these long lead times, and not just a trade war, but now we have a hot war that we're dealing with, which is going to add further disruptions to the supply chain. And a pretty unanimous view from most of the distribution executives that I've talked to, pushing these elevated lead times out at least to the first half of 2023. Then it's causing others to have to reevaluate and go even further in understanding their supply chains, even to the raw materials point now. It's been widely reported about neon large suppliers of neon coming out of the Ukraine, supplying half of the semiconductor grade neon to all the major semiconductor manufacturers in the world. And you could go on to nickel and other precious materials. So Russia, it's disruptive, not that they make semiconductors and not that they are a major consumer even of semiconductors, but the role that they do play in the supply chain can be very significant. And then of course, China, I don't have to tell everybody the key role that China plays. And we've already dealt with the incredible port congestion in the ports in China, especially in Shenzhen. And now with the COVID zero policies and the extreme lockdowns that have taken place, there's no way of getting around the impact that's going to have on electronics equipment and component production. So, they're tough blows from both directions.
Yeah, it's just one disruption after another at the moment, isn't it, Dale? And it just seems that is something we're dealing with. And as you say, when we look at the Ukraine-Russia situation, it's all about the supply chain further down than the semiconductor. It's mainly about the materials that go into it. And as we've started to try and maybe shift some supply chain dependency from China, this is almost pushing it back in that direction, because a lot of those raw materials that are available in Russia are, the other source of them is quite often China.
Yeah, you talk about crisis management. It was, roughly 10 years ago, I attended a major conference, energy conference hosted by IHS. And at that conference, they had major government figures and industry figures. And it was very interesting. Two of the presenters, one of them was the CEO of General Electric at that time. The other one had just retired as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the chairman of General Electric stated that they had now moved to, in their management approach, a continual crisis management mode. So General Electric, starting 10 years ago, had moved permanently to crisis management operating procedures. And he said, this is in response to our observations of the increasing number of natural disasters at that time around the world and the disruptions caused by that. The next morning, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral William Crowe, he stated, "I agree with what was stated, with this exception, that the natural disasters are coming more frequently and they're coming with greater intensity." And we're now building on top of that, unfortunately, with man-made disasters.
Yeah.
So John, what impact are the two big issues having on your business, on TTi there?
Yeah, so if you look at the Ukraine and Russia situation, clearly we're starting to see it have some impact on demand. And I think we're going to continue to see that evolve. Really, the thing that we've seen right now from the suppliers is raw material prices going to continue to go up, which is going to impact the price of components. You talked about neon, but there's also nickel, there's palladium, there's titanium, there's iron ore. A lot of things come out of that region. So I think we need to be prepared that there's going to be significant price increases that will continue to hit the supply chain as we go forward and we deal with this situation. I think if you switch to the lockdowns and things in China, that's just adding more to the in-transit times. I've got suppliers now telling me I've got to ship from a different area. That's going to add 14 days to the in-transit times. And we've already seen our on-time delivery from our suppliers running at record low levels.
Mm-hmm.
I expect to see that continue, which makes it more of a challenge as they do everything they can to react, but it's causing lead times to continue to extend, and they're missing those lead times in many cases.
Yeah. So even when you've got very long lead times, there is no guarantee that you're going to get the product at that time.
That's exactly right. The logistics is still very challenged right now. It continues to get worse with the lockdowns.
Yeah. So is there any light?
Yeah, really.
Can you even see the end of the tunnel?
I I do think there is light at the end of the tunnel. I think as we get into I'm going to speak on the IP&E side here for a minute. I do think as we get into next year, there is capacity coming online. So I do think you'll start to see lead times slowly start to come down. I think they somewhat have peaked in many areas. There's still pockets that are long, but I think as we get into next year, those lead times will start to come down. I think the challenge will still be on the semiconductor side. I think there'll be pockets of the semiconductor side that are tight through all of 2023. So you're still going to have that golden screw phenomenon that everybody is dealing with today.
Mhm.
Yeah. You agree with that, Dale?
The lead times, it is interesting. There's definitely a difference in behavior between semiconductors, passive components, and the interconnect and electromechanical devices.
Mhm.
Interestingly enough, the one that's been impacted the least has been the electromechanical world. And the category there that's really been impacted the most has been power supplies, which is due to their inability to source discrete and analog semiconductors that are needed to produce power supplies. But the good news is that's a sector, while it's been impacted, it's nothing even close to the degree of passives and semiconductors. And the unfortunate thing is it seemed that we had perhaps for a few months topped out in terms of extending lead times in semiconductors, but the latest results that we reported for semiconductors turned that right around and took us to a new high overall for the semiconductor category. You had a real jump in microcontrollers and processors. Discretes and analog and logic all really jumping up in terms of lead times. On the passive side, what we saw were jumps, specifically the strongest jump in resistor lead times. Capacitors a bit of a turnaround. They've topped out a little bit, but went up a little bit more. But resistors are the ones that we've noted really jumped up, and so those are the actual results that we've seen from March. But then in our survey, asking the participants in our electronic component sales trend survey their expectations for lead times, we saw a big push out in terms of continued increases, expectations, especially for semiconductors and passive components. So both in terms of actual results and expectations, we're seeing that at least for the foreseeable future, we are still going to be battling these extended lead times.
Hey, John, from your side, are we seeing, we're seeing this unprecedented disruption to supply. What are we seeing on the demand side? Are we seeing an unprecedented high level of demand at the same time, which is just exacerbating the situation?
Yeah, the booking rates still continue to be at record levels.
And that
is
tactical bookings, or are they real bookings?
Well, that's so we're looking at the bookings that we're getting from our customers. We're assuming obviously that they're real, and we're checking on that almost daily with the sales organization. Are these real? And then, what they're telling us is they are real. And once we get that, certain semiconductor part, we're going to build. But clearly with the book to bills that the whole industry has seen, there's obvious concern that those aren't sustainable.
Yeah, so you have this crazy book to bill situation. You have a supply chain that's out of whack. At some point, the supply chain catches up or does something towards catching up. Is there concern of a big inventory overhang, or do you think because of the way people manage their supply chains now and the fact that they're much more digitally transformed, people have a much more solid grip on their inventory levels than they did last time?
So historically, you would say no. We've seen it when the market turns that there's a lot of inventory that gets built up throughout the entire supply chain. I do think this time it will not be as much inventory. I think there will be pockets of inventory that are built out there. Overall, we're starting to see some build in distribution inventory. Some EMS partners have some build in inventory. But again, it's tough to tell because they're missing one or two components that if they get, they're going to consume that inventory. So
it's the difference between inventory and work in progress in that
that's
case,
correct.
isn't it?
So, I think is that people are becoming more sophisticated in their supply chains and getting more visibility to inventory, trying to do a better job of making sure they don't build inventory. But I do think based on the booking rates we're seeing, there is some inventory being built.
Do you note any difference in particular sectors? Like, I mean, we've been talking a lot about EVs lately, right? And how booming and a lot of companies entering that space. Do you see differences in how this is all impacting the various sectors? And you mentioned automotive. I haven't spoken to somebody automotive here just today, I think you said. So, but what's your sense of that?
Yeah, I think that the challenge right now in automotive is the demand is obviously there. They just can't produce the vehicles due to the fact they can't get the parts, right? So, I think the automotive business looks healthy for, a while to come, as there's that built up pent up demand, right? Just look at the dealerships, lots you drive by, they're still pretty sparse in terms of the vehicles. So I think that looks good. So I feel like as they continue to get the semiconductor product they need, they're going to continue to ramp up production. I do think one of the things that we haven't touched on yet that is also an issue is if they could get the parts, can they get the labor to build?
Yeah.
Hearing more and more from our customers that, I'm running first shift full, second shift pretty good. I really need to run a third shift, but I can't get enough workforce to run that third shift. So I think that's also gating our ability to produce even more. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, as we go through the balance of the year, as I think the labor market is going to continue to be tight. We face that same battle here.
Yeah. I think skill shortages are is the next big shortage that people have to deal with, and that's not just in North America. That's everywhere, including mainland China.
Correct.
And especially when you've got areas on
look
lockdown
at-
as well.
If you look at the data that IHS Markit publishes in their PMI surveys, they're on one of the charts, they show both material shortages and staff shortages on the same chart, and how severe they are. And they note with each new wave of Omicron, you see a surge in staffing shortages that come through. The good news is we're the latest report, we're coming down on that. And it's interesting, almost counter-cyclically, from the labor shortage, you have the material shortage. So when the labor shortage gets better, the material shortage gets worse.
Yeah.
And so it's like if one isn't getting you, the other one will. So you do go back and forth between material shortages and staff shortages as manufacturers try and manage this.
Yeah.
Hey, Dale, how do you see? I noted in your recent write-up about talking about various industry sectors. Share some of that and how you're seeing the impact.
Well, the interesting thing is from our survey a year ago, looking at the top 50 authorized distributors in the Americas, 58% of their market went to industrial electronics of some type or another, whether it's energy generation, automation, medical, military, aerospace. So the industrial segment is very important to what's taking place with the distributors. And there's still really strong optimism for that industrial segment, and even opportunities to make further penetration by distributors in that space. The thing that I heard expressed from a number of executives is that they believe that we're in a much more diversified marketplace, that just as a diversified stock portfolio can minimize the swings and the risk profile, that this more diversified marketplace will help us perhaps minimize the impact of the swing. The industry will continue to be cyclical. Nobody's saying that won't be the case, but the cross-platform applications of connectivity and communications technologies, for example, the cross-platform applications of artificial intelligence, all of these various technologies that don't have just one segment that they're targeting, they really broaden their ability to drive opportunities. And so the breadth of the opportunity is, I think, what they're seeing. There may have been a surge in the near term with work from home in terms of sales of compute platforms, but we still are way out in terms of needing demand in server farms, data storage, and they show, you're down to single digit numbers in terms of the percentage of the data that's out there that's being analyzed and utilized and acted upon. There's just a completely untapped opportunity really there for data science and whatnot. So I'm quite optimistic, frankly, in the long term for the industry. And I do believe that the diversification we've seen will help us on the backside of this cycle.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you, Dale. You know, if you look at the business overall, we saw strength in every segment of our business other than Mil Aero in 2021. And now we're starting to see that business start to strengthen. So I agree with you. You know, what's unique about this upturn is it's not coming from one segment or one application, one device driving it. It's coming from a broad base of different segments in the business. And I agree with you. I think long term, we're still going to have ups and downs in this business, but it's still going to be up and to the right when it's all said and done.
Yeah, and that gives you cause for optimism. Hey, John, before we started, you asked me about just in time, and is just in time a thing of the past? Have we replaced it with just in case? What are you sensing from your customers? You got to ask me, I didn't get to ask you the same question. So
yeah, so you know, what I'm seeing is clearly this shock to the supply chain has reinforced the need for inventory. And I think the question comes down to, the question comes down to who's willing to hold the inventory. And I think it bodes very well for the distribution channel. That is our business, to hold inventory. And so, you know, we see more and more customers coming to the distribution channel to figure out how do we partner together and really do supply chain programs for them. So I think you're going to see that there's going to need to be inventory held at multiple places. And distribution is going to play a bigger part in that as we go forward. So we're excited about that opportunity that it's bringing us.
Yeah, and the companies that are coming to you asking those questions, are they EMS companies? Are they OEMs?
It's really across the board.
Yeah,
we're really seeing it from all segments. You know, how do we make sure that we've got assurance of supply built into the model, right? And they realize that if we're going to look at demand shock or supply shock, the best way to buffer that is there's going to have to be some inventory built into that.
Yeah.
As you were talking,
to collaborate.
You know, that inventory situation, the just in case and whatnot, you know, as you were talking a little bit just before we started going live here, you're just starting to touch on the issue of cash flow and cash crunch that customers are going to start experiencing, in particular, the smaller customers. And the last thing that we want to see is the loss of customers because of the cash crunch that they're experiencing right now. They've got all these parts they've bought, they've purchased, and they can't make that product for what I think, John, you called the golden screw. And so there's going to be a role there for distributors to really play a critical role in helping with these financial situations that so many people are facing right now.
Yeah, because if there's more stock in the supply chain, somebody has to fund that stock. And if you're a small EMS player, I mean, when I talk to small EMS players, they kind of feel they're in two tough places. One tough place is they're not big enough to have the influence they would perhaps like to have with their component distributor or component suppliers. And that's a very interesting debate. And one that's driving a bit of consolidation. And the other one is they've all pretty much doubled their work in progress or their inventory. And if you're a small EMS company, that's a significant pull on cash flow. So yeah, it's definitely creating challenges. And at the same time, you know, they've got supply chain managers who are pulling their hair out thinking, hey, maybe I'll go and retire and become a golf caddy or something. And you know, adding to the challenge of managing all that, and the added issue of the tension in the relationship they have with their customers, because they're continuously going back to their customers and say, hey, you know, that work in progress is still work in progress because we still don't have that part. So it's it's challenging out there.
Hey, let me ask it a related different angle on the whole, you know, the inventory, and I get that, but the whole issue of reshoring of manufacturing, but related to that, the reshoring of the critical supply chains. That's been a big movement and getting a lot coming out, especially with the pandemic, and we discover. What are you seeing in terms of diversifying the component supply base out of Asia? You know, we've seen people, there's been talk about that, but it still resides there. This impact with China being locked down, and the lockdowns has a direct impact on that will slow that down. Do you see any movement? Is there discussion of that? John, what's your view?
Yeah, so, you know, I would say we're seeing, you know, the first movement was out of China. And that was to Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, places like that. And now what we're seeing is now the movement to mostly Mexico is where we're seeing a lot of it. They want to be closer to consumption. And take out some of those challenges in logistics. So we are seeing our business in Mexico is doing extremely well. And as we talk to more and more customers and suppliers, they're going to continue to move operations to Mexico or expand operations in Mexico. So you know, some in North America, in the U.S., but more into Mexico is what we're seeing, and I think you're going to see that continue.
You see that too, Dale?
It's going to be a long-term process, as everybody knows. This isn't something you have to have infrastructure put in place, and recreating a supply chain is a daunting challenge. Now, on the semiconductor side, the good news is we've had a number of major announcements by the top manufacturers. You have Samsung, you have TSMC, you have Intel, all with these major fab announcements that are going to be, you know, launched here in the next year or so. And so that's an encouraging development in my view. And it's beyond just bringing it into the United States or even into Mexico. The concept, if people look at critical supply chains, is you want to source more of your supply from friendly economies, I think is how they put that. And so, you know, teaming up with Europe, teaming up with other friendly economies can be a very good situation as well. Because the thing is even if you have the US government putting in their $52 billion, if they do that with their legislation, that's nothing compared to what the European Union is planning to invest, or what South Korea is planning to invest, Taiwan. So these are going to be important initiatives to be pursued. They'll take an extended amount of time. But then just one last point, you have to be careful, even if you bring it in, we have internal issues that have yet to be resolved. The transportation issues has not gone away. And one very big issue that remains, you know, we talk about ships stacked up in ports. Well, you also have the issue of truckers.
Yeah.
And the regulations that are going into place, California's Air Resources Board, CARB, just passed the rule that by 2023, you have to have an engine in your truck that's newer than 2010. And what that's going to do is take 17% of the trucking fleet off the road. And as the trucking industry says, if you think you've got a problem now, just wait till that takes effect. Yeah. So we have internally, even if you bring things back on shore, we still have to address our internal challenges of logistics and transportation that exist out there within our own borders.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you see shorter supply chains as part of a future vision? Do you think that's the way? I'm certainly talking to EMS companies a lot, but also OEMs that are telling their EMS companies, we want to start building in region for region. You know, we want to be building in the Americas, for the US market specifically. And I think that's what's driving a lot of growth in Mexico in particular. And that, you know, they want to be building in Asia for Asia. They want to be building in India for India. And I know, Eric, you've got your finger on the pulse of what's going on there as well. Is that changing the way people are thinking about supply chains? And are they looking to create shorter and as a result, more resilient supply chains? Any thoughts, John, Dale?
Go ahead, Dale.
Well, one of the key benefits of a shorter supply chain is that it also allows you to be more responsive to changes in the end market. These
Mhm.
longer supply chains, you're having to bet a little bit more, take more risks in terms of what you're doing. And if you're able to shorten that supply chain and make it more responsive to the end market, there's significant benefits that come out of that. So beyond just potentially shortening lead times and removing risk and being dependent on another region, the ability to be more responsive to the markets in a region is a significant goal to work to achieve.
But
Yeah.
if go ahead, John.
Yeah, I would agree with Dale there. What we're seeing from our suppliers is they want to be able to react quicker to upticks or downturns in demand. And when you've got a supply chain that some of these are from the time the raw material comes out of the ground till it's actually made could be upwards of a year. And so they're trying to figure out, if I take 6 months out of that, that's a tremendous amount. I don't have to worry about all that WIP that just got put in place. So I think you're seeing the suppliers try to figure out that piece of the model. And we're going to continue to evolve and see more efforts put there.
What I was going to say was, the reshoring is not just, and we're talking about this, the semiconductors, right? But once the semiconductors, if they build everything they say they're going to here, the packaging, the PCB fabs, that's all still an Asia-based activity, right? So we're gonna build the semiconductors here conceivably, then we're gonna ship them back to Asia and source everything and bring it back over. Well, I guess what I'm curious about is, do we see any shift of that material supply base with some of those companies looking to invest? Mexico makes good sense. Why we don't have a big PCB fab down in Mexico is still beyond me, right? Why we don't. And have the related issue, and you touched on it before, John, about labor, right? Do we have the knowledge base to be competitive in some of these activities still? So,
and the talent. You mentioned printed circuit boards there, Eric. I think that's a key one, and a lot of the companies that are saying, the semiconductor shortage is just one of the shortages they're really suffering from, and PCBs have been another one, and that's an industry that's very dependent. But we have seen some growth recently in the European printed circuit board industry, and some of the factories that were really in decline are starting to pick up business, and people are starting to accept that it's valuable to be able to buy printed circuit boards locally, and maybe acceptable to pay a little bit more for them. So yeah, I think there's a realization that there are a whole bunch of parts of the supply chain that we've allowed to become very dependent on certain regions. And 9 times out of 10 that is Asia and China. So yeah, I think there's a requirement to build out that supply chain elsewhere, and it makes sense sustainably as well.
With PCBs, that's a very fragmented industry. You don't have the strong consolidation that you see in other areas. And so I can see pluses and minuses to that type of fragmentation that could make it more open to being able to relocate that activity more easily with the way it's fragmented, the multiple players that are playing there. The very interesting thing about packaging is this. If you go and you look at the import-export data that the US government publishes, you would think, okay, I'm going to see that Taiwan is the major supplier of semiconductors to the United States, maybe followed by South Korea and then China. Well, roughly 80% of the semiconductors we say that are imported to the United States, guess where they come from? Malaysia, because that's where they do the packaging.
Yeah.
And so it's not so much that the packaging is taking place where they're making the back end is not located the same place the front end is. So yes, you do have the ability for having those located in 2 very different locations, but we do have major packaging companies that are headquartered here in the US, and I see it as very much doable that you could locate that packaging activity in Mexico, and maybe Malaysia is probably a bastion of stability compared to other places that you might look at. So I don't worry quite as much about the packaging piece of that.
Yeah, it's the silicon part.
John, any comments?
No, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that, they're going to have to look at all options there. And I think right now, Mexico is, to service the US market, Mexico is the best option that we see right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's becoming increasingly popular. What
Well,
do you see?
Mexico, there's a proposal to build out a trans-American transportation system that will go all the way from Canada down to Chile, Brazil, and to really, the economists, one of the big issues economists talks about, we're talking about the supply of labor. And major countries like the US, China, Europe, Japan, our birth rates and the growth of a young working population is flashing red warning signals to the economists.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the great opportunities that we have is to tap into not just Mexico, but Brazil, to tap into Latin America. They have much younger populations that create real opportunities to meet the real need we're going to have for supply of labor.
Yeah, and that's a high number of young graduate engineers that can find their way into the industry. I think that's always been one of the values that Mexico's been able to offer. You look at a city like Guadalajara and the number of universities that are cranking people out into the electronic manufacturing industry is impressive. And the quality of the labor is really high. You look at the big EMS companies, and they have a lot of their smart factory initiatives down in Guadalajara and are doing so very successfully. So, yeah, I think that's a significant area. What about supply chain technology? Is there anything in that area? Is there anything that can be done to improve supply chain in terms of the tools that you use? I was really pleased, John, to hear that EMSs and OEMs are talking to you about how to kind of reassess and redesign supply chains. But are there tools that we need that they should be using?
Yeah, I think that the key is we've got to figure out a tool that we can use to get visibility throughout the entire supply chain. Doesn't really exist today, but I think that's what we're all working towards. And that's going all the way to the raw materials coming out of the ground, right? To really assess what would those impacts be if you saw a big demand increase. How would we handle that if there's a shock to the system? And so, I think that the distribution industry is looking at that as a whole, saying we got to kind of lead the way and figure out how do we come up with some technology that we can use, that we can integrate with our suppliers to be able to give our customers real-time access to that entire supply chain. That's a huge need, and we've got to figure that out.
And is that some kind of open data collaboration that's needed?
Yeah, I mean, that's the tough piece, right? Because you've heard some people say in the industry, everybody needs to go to a third party and put all their demand in there and figure out, exactly what is the true demand, right? And I think that's going to be hard to get people to do, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's still going to be, individuals working on trying to come up with a solution for that. And then there'll be partnerships and stuff that evolve out of that. But I don't think there's going to be one third party that everybody's willing to dump all their information into yet. I think we're ways away from that.
No, we're a ways off that.
Yeah, ECIA has actually been involved in trying to facilitate improvements here. A couple of things that have been done. There's a new software tool called Extract, Transfer, Load, ETL, that's set up to facilitate communication in this design, in the supply chain, and working between the manufacturers, the distributors, et cetera. And it's early in that process, but there have been a couple of major manufacturers now that have adopted this ETL tool. What we're trying to achieve is greater velocity and efficiency with the data. So another area we've been involved with is updating the design registration process. And we went through a major study working with distributors and manufacturers there, manufacturer representatives, where we haven't dictated any one solution, but we've gone and we've said, these are the key elements that you need in a design registration. Then we've actually gone out and worked with 5 different vendors and shared with them the needs that we have. And now these vendors are now educated, sensitized to what they need to do if they want to pursue opportunities for their particular software or service offering in our industry. So being able to communicate that to third-party vendors and platform providers, I think can really help, because that's what I've heard coming from the executives, is it's the velocity of information and it's the efficiency of dealing with that information.
Yeah. And John, as you say, it's all about visibility as far up and down the supply chain as you can possibly get it. So, you know, like when we do have a situation like Russia and Ukraine, being able to see what that impact is going to be pretty quickly, and what needs to be done to mitigate that impact needs to be done with solid data.
You know, I remember doing a conference, in early 2000s in San Jose, California, and we had a panel, and they were talking about, and they said at the time, what we need in the industry, and they called it a glass pipeline. And that's kind of what you're saying, visibility throughout.
There you go.
Glass pipeline to show everything. And I'm struck by, here we are 20 years later, and I guess it didn't happen, right?
It's still not glass.
We're still needing that. I can only imagine that, you know, the incredible growth of the industry and the success before all the craziness of the last many years just bred probably some complacency, and people just, you know, they stayed in their lanes, right? Maybe current situations and, you know, the dire situations we're facing one after another might be a motivation to actually get something done now, because, you know, everybody wants it. It's just, you know, who's going to do it? Like you said, John, third party, who are they going to trust to say, here, you take it, and kind of, right? I mean, that's a challenge. So
necessity is the mother of invention.
Yes,
so people need to, you know, people get creative when times are tough.
You know, and because we know, you know, history teaches the next disruption is coming, right? And everyone speculates what it is, and you know, many people think it's the China-Taiwan situation that could, you know, that if we think it's bad now, that's going to change everything dramatically bad, right? And so I want to be respectful of the time and end on, hopefully try to get on a positive note here. So I'm going to come back to, you know, your view of moving forward. And John, before we started, you were making some comments about it at a macro level. You think things are still are generally trending positive right now. Elaborate on that, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, you know, overall, we still see demand very strong. And again, talking to the customers, their demand is still there. You know, I'm concerned that if they don't get parts at some point in time, you know, what happens to that demand, obviously? Does that demand eventually go away? But, you know, we feel like the balance of this year, based on the lead times and the backlog, looks pretty good. I do think over time, the bookings have to moderate. They can't stay at the levels that they've been. And so I do think at some point in time, we may see book-to-bills go negative. And I think the industry doesn't need to panic when that happens, because there will be some resetting there and some realignment. But overall, again, I think the electrification of everything is here. The digitization of everything is here. And long term, this is still a really good business to be in. That's going to have very good growth rates going forward. So we're planning for the long term, and we're optimistic about that.
Very good.
I think you should look. I know we've talked about being worried about the bookings, but the sell-through is incredibly impressive.
It is.
If you look at statistics, since we started this current cycle, upcycle in the semiconductor industry, looking not at revenues, but at unit shipments, on a worldwide basis, unit shipments are up for discretes nearly 33%.
Huge
recovery. Analog, nearly 47%. Logic ICs, over 61%. And then even more impressive is if you look at the Americas, since the start of the recovery, unit shipments are up 125% for discrete components, and for ICs, 64%. So we can be worried about the bookings legitimately, but we should feel very good that we are selling through an incredible volume of electronics components.
Yeah.
Now, the ASPs are going up now, and that's going to be a driver probably of revenues in 2022. But through 2021 and the first part of this year, the driver has been shipments, unit shipments of components into the supply chain, which is incredibly impressive. If you
Yeah,
look,
and a cause for optimism.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. Certainly with the EMS CEOs I'm talking to, whilst they're pulling their hair out and they're concerned about the supply chain issue, they're incredibly optimistic about their industry. And I think those that are the smart ones are the ones that are talking to people like John and saying, you know, how do we prepare for the next disruption, whether it's geopolitical, whether it's, you know, whether it's environmental, or whether it's, you know, a medical thing or whatever. You know, there is going to be another disruption. The only sure thing is we don't know what it is, and it will surprise us when it arrives. So how can we be prepared for that? So those companies that are getting creative, that are embracing disruption, that are designing their supply chain for disruption, and maybe even designing some products for disruption, are going to come out of this whole change in the industry pretty well, I think. And yeah, there's so much optimism at the very top end in terms of the consumer demand. There's just plenty of demand for electronic manufacturing out there.
Yeah.
we're going to change some of our practices as a result of this. One of them that is changing now is a design engineer. As they create their design, they're going to deliberately be building into that process the ability to respond to a shortage of a particular component in their design. That's
Design
going
for
to have to
disruption.
be part of the process. So you've got a design disruption. And again, distributors are ideally suited
to help with that.
supporting companies in that scenario to help them look at an approved vendor list and how they can develop designs that help them have greater abilities to weather disruptions.
Yeah. And Dale, you're absolutely right. The distributor's got a great role to play there, because what you need to understand when you are designing for disruption is don't design for two components that have actually got the same supply chain dependency one stage down. You need help to be able to do that, to be able to figure that out. So there's an important collaboration there and an important role to play.
Good. Gentlemen, you did it. You ended on a positive note. Look at that. That was very good. Well done.
We're all smiling. Good job.
Yeah. Listen, gentlemen, I want to end this by saying thank you. John, thank you for agreeing to come on. Hopefully you will come back in the future. And
absolutely.
And insights again. Dale, we always appreciate your insights and the work you do for the ECIA there. And Phil, I'm just glad to see you out from Australia. So
out and about.
Don't go too crazy in Europe there. So, but gentlemen, thank you very much for your time, for your insights today. I know our audience appreciates it, and I wish you continued success.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.